Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of PR Explored. I'm so glad you're all here today joining us. We have a wonderful guest today who I will introduce in just a minute. But I just want to welcome everyone to PR Explored, which is a video podcast where we delve into trends and topics related to public relations. I'm your host, Michelle Garrett. I'm a public relations consultant and writer. And today, my guest is someone I have followed for a long time on social media, and I've always appreciated his insight. And I'm so happy that Peter Himler of Flatiron Communications is joining me today. Thank you, Peter.
Hi, Michelle. I am delighted to be here.
Yay. Yeah, I have been following you. I don't know. I'm sure it started on Twitter, but I've always appreciated your insight. And this kind of started when I saw one of your Medium posts, but we'll get into that in just a minute. At first, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your background because you have quite a lot of great experience, and I'd love for you to tell us about it.
So if you look at my LinkedIn profile, you'll see that I'm a New York agency kind of guy. I started out in the entertainment industry at a boutique firm in the city from a famous guy named Bobby Zarum, and we did some really high-profile entertainment, films, theater, music, etc. And I cut my teeth with him and then went on to the big agencies. So I went from Bobby to Hill Knowlton, then to Cohn Wolfe for 5 years. And then the mothership, Cohn Wolfe sister agency, Burson, grabbed me and I went over there for 11 years. And then off to Edelman. And then I started my own company in 2005 called Flatiron. My first client was the New York Times company because I had them at Burson as a client, and they wanted to work with me again, and it was an opportunity for to hang a shingle, and so I did that and have not looked back.
Isn't it great? I mean, I also work for myself, and I don't really have an agency or a team necessarily. It is really nice to have that freedom to kind of work for yourself. So
It's nice to work with people. It's nice to run groups. It's nice to brainstorm, not on Zoom in person,
yeah.
but it's been a very rewarding. So I left the big agency world right as the gig economy was kicking in. So I have a
Mhm.
pretty big network. I won't tell you how many decades I'm in this business, but I have a big network, and a lot of the really talented people that I knew, many of them were untethered. They were not working, and I was able to create a model whereby Flatiron, we put together bespoke teams with the right skill sets and the right industry experience to service clients. And I keep about 4 or 5 clients. That's all. And but it's worked out. It's a great model, and it's worked out really well for me.
That's great. Um, I I really, like I said, I've always appreciated your insight, and you have kind of, you have a lot of opinions and a lot of thoughts that you share on social media. And I came across one of your Medium posts not too long ago that kind of spurred this conversation. As far as kind of where we're going with media, because we know that things are changing. Of course, they're always changing. That's not new. Change isn't new, but the way it's changing is new. So we know clients really love traditional media, but they kind of need to start paying more attention to what we would call maybe non-traditional media. So today we're going to be talking all about, what is non-traditional media? Why should clients care about it? And we'll get into all of that. So
So, as much as has changed in terms of the media universe and in terms of the way in which we engage journalists, there's one thing that hasn't changed, and that is we're being paid to build a presence, to build a media presence for our clients, or
mhm.
conversely, to keep them out of the media, depending upon the situation they're in. I remember my very first job, my first day of work in public relations. I didn't know what public relations was. I was whisked over to 30 Rockefeller Plaza, NBC studios in New York, and I was the new publicist on a show called America Alive. And it was a midday talk show featuring Bruce Jenner as the host. And and Jack Linkletter, et cetera. And on that show, it was a reunion of the Mouseketeers. And I was asked to just take notes on what they were doing these days. And so I got back to my office and typed it up on my manual typewriter. My boss edited it, and we messengered it over to a reporter at the UPI. And then 2 weeks later, we get in the mail a clip of his story on everything that I wrote. And I said, what? I mean, where's my byline, first of all, and second of all, so this is what we did. We pitched stories, we proposed ideas, and so we still do that. But the media, the ecosystem, the Mediaverse, if you will, has changed
Mhm.
considerably. You have newspapers drying up. You have media deserts in a lot of towns. So you have, you know, people not appointment TV changing. I mean, I realize 60 Minutes and Saturday Night Live still get big audiences, but most don't. And GMA and Today, they're still important. I guess the point of the piece that I wanted to make that you referred to was the idea that a lot of clients they still want that big branded media coverage. Now, I don't
Mhm.
know if it's ego driven or what, but I started thinking about, well, what is the impact on an ephemeral story that runs in a big newspaper and it's there for one day and then it disappears,
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the digital outlets and other genres that I mentioned in the piece, whether it's Substack or whether it's podcasting, et cetera, or whether it's a TikTok video, they tend to have more legs. They tend to be amplified across the digital, and whereas legacy media, while they have invested a lot in digital and they have repurposed their content across multiple platforms, YouTube, et cetera,
Mhm.
they you have to look at what it is you're trying to accomplish, and so that was, I guess, the impetus for writing that piece on Medium.
Mhm. So, to kind of be very specific, when we talk about traditional media, we're talking about, the Washington Post, the New York Times,
NBC News,
ABC. Yeah, right.
CNN, all the legacy outlets.
But when we talk about non-traditional media, we're talking about newsletters, podcasts.
TikTok influencers, Instagram Reels,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. We're also talking about what I call influential outlets, and they could be paywalled or not. Most of them are
Mhm.
paywalled. Outlets like Semaphore, outlets like The
Mhm.
Information, Axios,
Mhm.
Puck. These are all important outlets that are read by mainstream legacy media, so they tend to catalyze coverage in mainstream. So yes, you could try to get the New York Times to do a story, or the Wall Street Journal to do a story, or The Economist, or get NBC Today Show to do a segment,
Mhm.
or PBS NewsHour. Okay, these are all really important. NPR. It's harder. It's really harder.
Mhm.
And I guess the thing that I've always sort of focused on is what outlets catalyze other outlets. It used to be, if you get a trade media story, it the beat reporter at the mainstream outlets would see that and would jump on it, and so now you have some of the outlets that I recommended, as well as some of the influencers on influential podcasters and TikTokers that can catalyze stories in mainstream, and um, and that's happened. So you have to be. I mean, listen, it used to be there were a lot more journalists. There were a lot more journalists on staff at legacy media. They're diminished. They're getting fired. The
Mhm.
size of their newsrooms are much, much smaller. And at the same time, the PR industry is exploding. So you have, I think it's at least 10 PR people for every journalist working today. And so it's really hard to break through that inbox,
Mhm.
because email
Yeah.
is still the way, to engage a journalist. And so you have to look at some of these other influential media, and
Mhm.
platforms to figure out, well, okay, you know, what is the tech reporter? What is Kevin Roos? at the New York Times, what is he following?
Mhm.
And and how do we, and that's a little bit easier to do. So I don't know if that does that make sense?
It does, and I have a follow-on question, but first, we have someone who is, watching, listening, has a question, so let's answer Domenica's question because I have thoughts on this, and maybe you do
Great.
too. So the question is, what are your thoughts on traditional media, more specifically, TV hosts that are asking for pay to play?
Yeah.
And I mean, you and I understand what pay to play is.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
it's when a host asks for money to put your client in a segment. And Dominica is saying that she's seeing a lot of that. And yeah, what I have thoughts. What are your thoughts?
So because the advertising model at most ad-driven media has been decimated because of digital, because of
Mm,
Craigslist, because of all kinds of things,
yeah.
the mainstream media has to resort to other ways to raise revenue. A lot of them, for example, I just had a client that won Fast Company's Most Innovative Company Award. And let me tell you,
Mhm,
it was expensive to apply to that award. And they have a big ceremony in New York in June, and it's expensive to go to that. So a lot, and they also won a Time Magazine Invention of the Year award, but it was
mhm,
expensive. So a lot of mainstream outlets are looking for other ways to generate revenue. They have events, they have conferences. Semaphore has some very big conferences because the advertising has dried up. So, long story short, Domenica, the fact is that even the network morning shows, which are part of the news divisions at the networks, are
mhm,
you have the ability to get your product on the air by paying for it. Now, a lot of
mhm,
my clients send me things. Oh, we just got an overture from a journalist that wants us on their podcast, or wants to do a video segment on us, but it's going to cost us, $5,000 in production fees. I
mhm.
always advise, look, they don't call it earned media for nothing. So I'm in the earned media space. So I
Mhm.
always advise my clients to avoid those pay for play.
Yeah. Well, here's my take on it. So I agree with you. I'm kind of a purist. It's earned media, paid media. But I will say, and I encourage clients if they can, if they have any of their budget that they can allocate toward paid, that works really well because on the editorial side, obviously, and it's not always like discussed, but they're probably going to pay more attention to companies that are paying to advertise or do sponsored content or something like that. So if they can, I say it's okay, but some of these opportunities are very like icky and I would be really careful when you choose if you are going to spend money on paid media.
So
I'd say
the
just be
the
careful.
line the lines have grayed, okay, between editorial
Mhm.
and business, okay, at a
Mhm.
lot of outlets, okay.
Mhm.
You look at Vogue, for example, and you'll see articles, and then a few pages after the articles, you'll see an ad from that client. So it's a
Mhm.
necessity because, again, the advertising
Mhm.
model is broken or has been decimated. On
Right.
the other hand, I don't think because the media has become so fragmented that
Mhm.
the New York Times, when I started in the business, set the national news agenda. A story
Mhm.
in the New York Times was picked up across the country by TV, by other news organizations, or an AP
Mhm.
story, and it had the ability to create action. It had the ability to create regulatory change, or
Mhm.
it could spur a congressional, inquiry. And so
Mhm.
there, so, but not so much anymore. I will say
Yeah.
this. So there isn't a panacea anymore. There isn't one, even a giant 60-minute story
Mhm.
is going to come and go, and it may have an impact, but it used to have much greater impact. So
Mhm.
to your point is, as influencers became important, social media influencers started to rise. A whole cottage industry of agents representing A, B, and C list influencers on
Mhm.
TikTok, on Instagram, on
Mhm.
YouTube. So if
Mhm.
you have the budget to purchase an influencer. And by the way, it used to be, you pay $100,000 for one tweet from Kim Kardashian or something, or one Instagram post,
Mhm.
but there are all levels. There are whole levels of influencers. It doesn't have to cost that much. So
Mhm.
because, I wrote a piece in Forbes some years ago called "Content Marketing is So Last Year." And it was facetious because content marketing is still very valid, creating
Mhm.
original content, getting op-eds,
Mhm.
all
Mhm.
that. But the point was that the influencers are starting to rise. And I started to question myself, well, can influencers have more influence than a news story? Which one is going to create the greatest action?
Mhm.
If someone
Right.
you follow and you admire they post something on TikTok or on Instagram and tells you
Mhm.
to go out and buy something, are you going to buy it? As opposed to if there's an item in Vogue saying buy it, they're both influential, but you begin to wonder. So, but the influencer costs money. That's not
Right.
that's not earned.
Right.
Yeah,
So that I think that's where some of us struggle with this because I always feel like, okay, well, if it's paid, then I'm going to send it over to the person that handles paid media
yeah,
versus my domain, which is earned media. But if you look at the peso model, like the paid, earned, shared, own
yeah.
model by Spend Sucks, then you would say, well, of course, these all kind of, overlap each other in some ways. And so, I mean, again, I think it hurts your credibility if you're only doing paid,
Yeah.
but I think the combination can be good, but I would be careful because I think in the question there it seems like some of these are just scams. They're not
They're scams,
really.
right? They're scams, and
Yeah.
you've got to ask them, where will this appear, okay, in what context?
Mhm.
Do you have any carriage on? You get a lot from, oh yes, we're on PBS stations. Well, which ones and when? Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think there are, like I said, I think there are good, there are good, smart ways to use your budget on paid media, but some of these are not like legit. So just be careful because I think this is growing. This kind of thing is growing. And I even had not too long ago a company try to sell a client. They didn't want money, but they wanted like access to their list of suppliers and vendors and things.
oh, I see.
And so you've gotta look like if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. That's always what I think, so I'm
I
like,
will say that most of the big agencies of the holding companies have departments that deal with paid influencers and
mhm,
activations and things that you pay
mhm,
for, to get
mhm,
coverage. But again, coming back to what I said at the very beginning of the conversation, the goal is the same: to build a footprint, and these
mhm,
days to build a digital footprint and amplify it.
mhm.
So that's the goal, and that has not changed.
So
Though the word
let's
digital probably didn't exist when I was starting out in the business.
no, well, and even now I feel like digital PR, sometimes it's more like link building. It's not really what PR people do. So it's confusing, I think,
Well,
a little
PR
bit.
people, are charged with advising their clients on how to amplify something. So if
Mhm,
there's a mainstream news story,
mhm,
how can you amplify it across your owned social media
mhm, mhm,
channels? How do you, and if you just put it on LinkedIn, you have a lot of followers and they repost it. So that's we do a lot of that. We do advise our
mhm.
clients on LinkedIn posts and
Sure.
reposting, so.
Yeah. Well, the follow-on question I had regarding non-traditional media is I think that, obviously those of us in PR and comms are understanding, there are non-traditional media outlets. Yes, we do need to be paying attention to those. But sometimes do clients understand this? I mean, do they always understand that this should be part of the media list or the plan?
I'm
They get
afraid,
it?
Michelle, that they don't. A lot of them hear Forbes, for example, or they hear Newsweek. Newsweek is a shadow of its former self. Newsweek, I think, is owned by the Moonies, or I don't know. It's got some squirrely, ownership. Newsweek and Newsweek and Time were the holy grails back in the day. If you had a Time
Right.
magazine story, a Newsweek story, that was something. Um, so but those brands still have a lot of clout with a lot of C-suites and a lot of CMOs.
Mhm.
Oh my
Mhm.
God, we're in Fortune, even though Fortune is a great publication. They're doing great journalism still. It doesn't have the panache that it had once.
Mhm.
I once led a panel, I forget, and I had Andrew Ross Sorkin and a bunch of people at the New York Times, and I suggested as moderated that the New York Times, because of fragmented media, didn't have the same influence. Well, Andrew went ballistic and called me out and said, "What are you, crazy?" And then listen, I will say that these outlets, The Economist, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, CNN, are still really important, and they still have a lot of value, and they still can catch on. They can still catalyze other interest, but but there are a lot of outlets that are shadows of their former self, and the clients still want those brands to say, "Oh, we were featured in Forbes, or we were featured in Newsweek, or we were featured," and
Mhm.
um, so the thing is, what is getting the interest of those legacy outlets?
Mhm.
How do you catalyze? What kind of outlets are they reading?
Mhm.
What trades and what influential, what they're reading, Puck, or they're reading, Semaphore, or Axios,
Mhm.
or Politico, or
Mhm.
there are a lot of these digitally native publications that are driving interest from legacy outlets. But I know I'm talking too much, so I will say that a lot of the legacy outlets don't have the ability to create action, to create a change as they once did. Now, I mean, you
Mhm.
look at CNBC, for example. CNBC is probably the most influential business cable network. Okay, on its best day, maybe it has 300,000 or 400,000 viewers. Right? Not a lot. Not a lot compared to some a TikTok, a viral TikTok video. Um,
Mhm.
However, look at the audience. And if you're trying to have a material impact on your company, on your stock, or whatever,
Mhm.
CNBC is really important. Bloomberg TV, even smaller audience, okay?
Mhm.
But it goes across several platforms. It goes and but it reaches a very specific audience. So I think that's another important point for PR people. It's look at the outlet and look at the quality of the audience, and does it
Mhm.
align with what you're trying to accomplish, who you're trying to reach?
Mhm. Oh, yeah, it's always about where the client's audience is spending time, and it's
Right.
so fragmented. I mean, I work with B2B clients, and for them, that's trade
That's
publications
absolutely true in
primarily.
B2B. Yeah.
And so, I feel like that's a little bit less, wild than B2C, which, I mean, is just, I think it would be very challenging. I mean, I know it can be challenging. So,
And
yeah.
listen, ours is a very subtle industry. Again, there's no one hit that's going to put your client on the map. It's working over time, and it's just, it's blocking and tackling and finding reporters, and ultimately you build a brand for that client, especially in the startup world, you know.
Yeah, well, I think that's an excellent point that no one hit is gonna put your client on the map, and I don't know if we really talk about that enough, but it's like, I like that a lot. So, I
I
hope
mean,
everybody.
there were some stats like I saw that Substack today surpasses legacy media with over 35 million active subscribers, including more than 5 million paid subscribers to Substack newsletters. Now, Substack is a phenomenon, and they got a little bit of trouble because they got political at one point, but they have enabled journalists a lot from legacy media who have been fired or took the early package,
Mhm,
and to actually monetize their work, their output.
mhm,
And it's searchable. And so you could search Substack and find by subject, and you can find the right reporters to try to engage on a story idea. Um, Same thing. Newsletters on LinkedIn from publishers have surged 150% with a combined 240 million followers on LinkedIn for newsletters. Um, so you have, but then you have stats like about half of TikTok users, 50%, 52%, or 70% of all US adults say they regularly get news on the site. So they get their news from TikTok. However,
news.
yeah, many TikTokers,
It's
many
not news.
TikTok users appear not to be actively following journalists or news media outlets on the platform. So, you
Mhm,
know, what else? 1 in 5 Americans now get their news from social media, from influencers on social media, including 37% of adults under 30. and viewers consume over 400 million hours of podcast contact per month on YouTube. So
Wow.
that's wow. I like Scott Galloway and Kara Swisher. I listened to their Pivot podcast, and when
Mhm.
Mark Zuckerberg of Meta was making all the noise about the Mediaverse and putting on the goggles, etc., Scott
Mhm.
Galloway, you know, disparaged him to no end. He was a big believer, and still is the idea that these earbuds, Apple iPods, whatever they're called, are driving the future, and that's why podcasts have become so popular. Um, there are some resources if you're looking for the right podcast that I should mention.
Mhm.
So I wrote a piece on this, other than on Medium as well.
I'll put that up too for people to
Yeah, so
appreciate.
it's hard to find podcasts. I mean, you could search Google and you could search Spotify for the top
Mhm.
100 podcasts, but most of
Mhm.
them are not relevant. So you need to be able to search podcasts by
Mhm.
subject, by size, by rating, by all that. And so, Muckrack, for example, I like Muckrack as my CRM. They have they're building out a podcast database. It's very impressive. There's a podcast database called 1 Million Podcasts that I like, that's
Mhm.
building out a searchable database of over a million podcasts. There's something called Raphonic,
Mhm.
Rephonic. That's another one.
Mhm.
And then there's Podchaser. So I wrote about these four. I spoke to their founders and wrote
Mhm.
about it on Medium.
Well, and a lot of, like, again, I'm gonna talk about trade media, because that's my world pretty much, but a lot of those publications also now have their own podcasts, so and then if you get your executives on their podcast, they will repurpose some of that in other ways, perhaps in, articles and things like that, so it's a nice way to kind of get multiple, pieces out of one effort, so your CEO might spend an hour talking to them on the podcast, but then, there's other things that roll out of that. So I think that's a really, that's a good.
A lot of the legacy media, and some of those legacy media podcasts are very big. I keep forgetting the one that was founded by one of the presidents of Fast Company. That's huge. I think he partners with Andreessen Horowitz, and they have this podcast, a lot of technology. I can't remember the name, but
Mhm,
there are some really popular podcasts. It's hard to find the audience size for these, other than what
mhm,
Spotify or Apple Podcast releases.
mhm,
But some of these platforms that I just mentioned do have an audience screen, so you can screen for the size, and
mhm,
geography as well.
mhm. Um, I Sean is saying that, he one of his major sources of US news is an influencer on YouTube, although he also watches mainstream media on YouTube. But here's the thing, when I found out that people were getting their news from YouTube and TikTok, and I was just kind of
Yeah, it
flabbergasted
gives me the
because that's a
heebie-jeebies.
scary
Yeah.
idea. But I know people do it, but I think you have to be
Well,
careful, like, what
I mean,
you're
in the
trusting
absence
in
of,
there.
with the absence of in these news deserts where there's no newspaper, okay,
Mhm,
and
mhm,
and local TV has been bought by conglomerates that sometimes put the same content across many different TV stations.
mhm,
Um, it's hard. I'll tell you this: my wife gives me a hard time. She says, "Peter, you have to listen to, you know." Fox News, and you have to see the other side of whatever. And I say to her, "No, I don't, because I like to consume journalism, vetted, fact-based
mhm.
journalism."
Well
So, yeah.
well, here's an idea, and this is not something we would plan to talk about, but I've been thinking about this. So, the fact that so many mainstream media outlets went with paywalls, I think drove a lot of people away, and, now we see, like, Wired has taken down the paywall for certain stories,
Yeah.
and so I think that this is a point that we need to talk about
So
or think
I wrote
about
a piece
too.
about this. Yeah, I wrote a piece about it. Do paywalls um, do paywalls hurt democracy or something? I forget what the piece was. This is a
Mhm,
couple 3 years ago. In fact,
mhm,
I was at a conference last summer with Ken Oletta and Walter Isaacson, and I asked Ken about that. Uh,
mhm,
and Ken, by the way, was the media, you know, guy at the New Yorker for many, many years. But yes, I believe that paywalls have hurt the national discourse, because most of the legitimate news organizations, legitimate journalistic enterprises are paywalled. And so
Mhm.
when Wired, because of the situation we're in right now with this changed administration, Wired, to its credit, Condé Nast owned Wired, um,
Mhm.
has agreed to open to take down the paywall for any FOIA, Freedom of Information
Mhm.
driven stories that they are publishing. And so they have a lot of FOIA requests of this administration, and they have to comply. And
Mhm.
so when they get information about what this administration is doing, they've agreed to take down the paywall, to its credit. And I hope
Mhm.
others follow that, Michelle. I really do.
Yeah, it's an interesting, idea because, again, I'm all for people, obviously we all have freedom of choice where we're gonna get our news and information, but just use care because, obviously some people that claim to be sharing news, it's opinion, it's not news. So we need factual, stories, that's what we need, and, I think.
Fact-based, vetted stories,
Mhm.
and yeah, yeah. So I
Yeah, and then just the trust of the mainstream media, I think, has also kinda driven some people away, to other sources, so.
so that the trust issue is interesting because it has been propagated by one political party that the news media is not to be trusted, for many years. They created this fabrication that the news media is liberally biased, when in fact, today it's quite the opposite. The news media is more conservatively biased, at least the news media that's consumed by most Americans, And so you look at Fox News numbers, for example. So I'll tell you this, I think what I would advise your viewers, listeners, is there are a number of reporters that have been following the changed media ecosystem rather intensely, and they're very smart. And a lot of them come out of legacy media. So some that I follow include Oliver Darcy. Okay, he has a newsletter called Status. He was the CNN and Reliable Sources news,
Mhm,
alongside Brian Stelter. You've got Peter Kafka, who for many years was at the Wall Street Journal, and he has a podcast called Channels with Peter Kafka, and in fact interviews some rather fascinating people. So I would listen to him. He's smart. I think he now works for Business Insider. Um, I like Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway, a very smart
mhm,
podcast. They cover a range of issues. Um, Dylan Byers,
mhm,
Byers from Puck, which is another digitally native, very influential news organization. They do a lot of great reporting. Um, I'm going to go on. And of course, Axios, Sarah Fisher from Axios. She's the lead media reporter there. She breaks
mhm,
a lot of stories, as does Semaphore's Max Tani, Tani, and the New York Times' Ben Mullen. They're breaking a
mhm,
lot of stories. And so,
mhm,
um,
mhm.
so these are folks that if you want to stay on top of the Mediaverse, these are folks to follow and to listen to what they're talking about.
Mhm. We have a couple of comments and questions that I wanna
Okay,
just
good.
touch on really quick. Not to cut you off, I agree with what you're saying there. Oliver Darcy is somebody I definitely have followed for a while now. So, on the podcast size question, and this is something I was gonna bring up when you're talking about podcasts, it can be very small, as long as it's hitting, the folks that you are trying to reach, and the other thing is Christopher Penn, who was my guest a few months ago, was talking about how it doesn't matter because all of that content is going to be ingested by the AI, by search engines and the AI-based search engines too. And so you're also going to show up more often in search. So that's going to help you in that way as well, which is what you want when someone is searching for what you do. You want to come up in that list of recommended
So,
sources.
so my most astute friend John Lee's comment is well taken. I mean, the fact is, and I mentioned this when I mentioned the CNBC example. CNBC may have an audience of 300 or 400,000, but look at the
Yep.
audience who they are. They're investors. And so that's important. Same thing with podcasts. It's finding out who the audience is. And again, these platforms that are searchable for podcasts can help you with that.
Mhm. Here's another question about they're talking about trade podcasts. Are they mostly paid? That's not what I am finding in the spaces that I work in the manufacturing space, for example. I'm not seeing that as much. I think there are always ways that they will offer you opportunities to take your money and spend money on boosting or doing, additional, you know, whatever things with them. But I have, in a lot of cases, been able to get clients on without paying for it. So I
Yeah,
don't know if
it's a
that's
mixed bag, but most of the legitimate established podcasts are
Mhm,
earned podcasts, earned media.
mhm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so don't be fooled if some don't fall for it if somebody wants thousands of dollars, but no, I know what Stephanie is saying there. Yeah, I think just finding the podcast, and so that's why I liked your Medium piece with some of those sources to help you find the podcast, and then also contacting them. A lot of them don't really have a good contact. They're all produced by bigger companies, and
Yeah.
then everything leads back to this one like email or generic, like contact. And it's like, well, that's not really, we need to get in front of the host or the producer or whoever it is that's selecting the guests. So,
I mean, if I don't know if anyone's in the technology space, we have a lot of tech PR folks out there, but
mhm,
there are certain podcasts that I happen to like. I like Casey Newton's Platformer. I like Casey Newton and Kevin Roos's podcast Hard Fork. Um, I like Nilay Patel, who's the editor of The Verge. He has a podcast called Decoder. So Verge, TechCrunch, um, you know, Casey Newton's platform, and these are all really influential podcasts that are listened to by a lot of journalists who write about technology.
mhm,
I guess the thing with me, and maybe it's out of fear of becoming a dinosaur, is I've always tried to stay on top of some of the trends that are happening, especially in the media. I was with a friend the other day, and we were talking a little bit about something that made me think twice and made me very worried, actually. It had to do with the idea that a lot of the stuff you see on social, TikTok or Instagram, et cetera, you could grow organically. It could catch on and become a viral sensation. However, right now they have bot farms that are run by
mhm.
governments, by the Chinese. I'm going to put something. Can the people see it in the chat? So I'm going to put a picture of a bot farm. This is a Chinese-run bot farm. Can everyone see that? And it basically,
Can't see it.
you can't click on it. It's an
Do you have a
Instagram.
link and I'll put it in the
I
chat?
did put a link in the, maybe it's a private chat or,
Okay, let me see. Yeah, I'll grab it here. Okay, I see it.
so what it means is that nefarious actors, Chinese government, Russians, etc., can create these huge bot farms that influence the algorithm of what catches on, what goes viral. And of course, obviously, they have their own agendas, and it's not news, it's not presenting journalism.
Mhm,
And so, and by the way, because the platforms, Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, they're not regulated. They're not, Section 230 doesn't, they treat them as an indifferent, platform. They don't, and not as a news organization where they could be held liable. They allow this to happen on their platforms, and it's scary because it's growing, and you're beginning to see stuff take off that have dubious origins, if you will. So
mhm,
this scares me a little bit. And listen, I was kind of interested in influencers and back in the day and content marketing and owned media when we did consumer generated media, and I try to stay on top of all that. But these bot farms are annoying, and if you think about how many bots there are on the major platforms, on Twitter, et cetera, Twitter
mhm,
especially. Um, the other thing that was kind of I'm not happy about, obviously, is what Elon Musk has done with Twitter. Not because the fact that he's infused Twitter with his, his politics, which is really horrible, but mostly because it's scared away a lot of journalists. Now, I was verified on Twitter as I write up I have two publications on Medium, and and I would engage with a lot of legitimate journalists on Twitter, and I got to know a lot of very well-known people. And as a PR person, that was a big, big plus to see what the conversation was on Twitter among those you're trying to pitch a story to, or you're trying to get interested in your client or whatever. And a lot of the legitimate journalists that were on Twitter have migrated to Threads and subsequently to Blue Sky. Threads, as you know, is owned by Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram, and Threads has decided to follow to some degree in Elon Musk's political footsteps, which is very disconcerting. Blue Sky is not. Blue Sky was founded by Jack Dorsey, who was one of the founders of Twitter. He no longer is involved with it, but it tends to be more balanced, less hysterical, less biased.
I think it's a matter of time, I'll be honest. I mean, I think a lot of people are a little bit like thinking Blue Sky's different, but I think it's a matter of time until they start having
Well,
ads and doing all that as
it's a
well.
matter until they change the regulations and make the platforms responsible for the content that crosses their platform. Right now they have no responsibility, they have no liability, no risk.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I see more journalists spending time on LinkedIn, and I'm on Threads more, and I see journalists over there, and there are still some on X, quite a few actually. So you just have to kind of know where the journalists that you need to follow are spending time. Again, it's very important to
Yeah, it
always
bothers
know.
me a little bit that journalists I know and like and respect are still on X. I don't know. But again, I'm a little biased.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to something else. I mean, we've kind of talked a lot about non-traditional media and how the trust the various issues with mainstream media have kind of driven people to other sources. What would you say? Uh, you know, what I don't even know which question to go to next, but what do you think about, how PR pros, again, like, how do we, when we're trying to get our client, out there and get them um, seen and mentioned and raise their visibility and have them show up in shirts, what are the best, what are some of your favorite tools or tips, or what would you say about that?
Okay. Well, there are three parts to engaging a journalist. One is to determine what the story is, okay? Probing your client, sitting down with your boss and saying, okay, what's so special about this? What are the superlatives? Is this the first time that it's being done in the industry, et cetera? So it's figuring out what the news hook is, okay? You've got to really be fastidious about how you engage journalists today, given the amount of emails that cross their desktop every day. The second thing is, well, how do you articulate that? And what I've been using is I like smart brevity. So I receive a lot of pitches from PR people, and they are voluminous. They're like 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs. Now, if you're familiar with smart brevity, which was created by Axios, one of the digitally native news organizations I mentioned, it's a very simple template that recognizes that recipients of your email are not going to read your whole email. So you need a clever and you need an opening sentence, 3 bullets, and an ask, and that's it. And if you can't capsulize what your pitch is in that format, you're not doing your client a service. There's also a site I like called Subject Line Tester. I forget the name of it. I think I have it in my bookmarks. And it lets you test email subject lines for their, engageability, if you will, that's a word. So it's, I guess the most important part, however, is not is recognizing the story. It's how you articulate, how you communicate that to a journalist, but then it's finding the right journalist.
Mhm.
As someone who writes for two publications and posts on my blog, etc., I get a lot of pitches, and there are some of them are so out of left field. It's as if they never read what I do. Sometimes I write back and I advise them, well, you might want to shorten this. You might want to read, which blog are you pitching of that I do,
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
so I think sometimes PR people, they're lazy. They like to, they'll go on, they'll go on one of the big CRMs, they'll create a list and they'll send out the same pitch. Well, if you create a media list, a target list, you have to know what everyone on that list does, who they are, what they write about. I know it takes time, but it'll pay off if you're well targeted.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah, the research. I mean, I talk and have written a lot about pray and spray, we pull down the giant list of thousands of journalists from, a media database, and we just spam out, we just spray out the same, generic pitch to all of them, and, that I don't know if that's ever worked, and it definitely is not gonna work now, and it's only gonna get you, thrown in the garbage, so
right.
please don't do that.
Or unopened, But the
Mhm,
other thing I would say is something I call the zeitgeist. So when
mhm,
you're sending a journalist, like we were representing one of the large port facilities on the West Coast, and it was just as the Trump administration announced tariffs. And so to send a reporter a pitch on a port facility and not know what was being discussed or what was in the media at the time, what was the zeitgeist, without
mhm,
mentioning tariffs, it's almost like it's bad practice. I mean, the journalist's going to get it. So, well, we're I mean, aren't they aware that what's going on? So you really have to have your finger on the pulse of what the journalist may be thinking about, and that's
mhm,
hard too. Um,
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time and research and, it's really but that's gonna win the day if that's what you really are trying to do is, get their attention and, hopefully, fit into what they're working on, so I think,
There's a
it's
there's
worth it.
something else I want to mention. A lot of people talk about AI and PR. I use AI a lot. I don't use it to write because I'm a
Mhm,
pretty good writer, but I use AI to assess the journalist's work. And for example, I'll set up an interview with a CEO client of mine, um, with, let's say, the Wall Street Journal editorial board, and I'll
mhm,
take every editorial, every opinion, everything that they've written about on the subject that my CEO is, on the industry my CEO works in, and I'll throw it into a platform called Notebook LM, which is owned by Google. Okay, it's Notebook LM. Now, Notebook LM is not a large language model. I wrote a piece on this, by the way. It's what I call a smart language model or a small language model. It allows you to put in up to 50 pieces of content and then query it. So I'll take all of those editorials that the Wall Street Journal editorial board has written on my client's industry, throw it into Google's Notebook LM, and I'll say, okay, what 10 questions will the editorial board ask of my client who's, and I'll nail 9 of those 10 questions. Or what are the key topics that they'll be interested in? And you could query
mhm,
that based on the body of work. So
mhm,
AI has been a very useful. That's just one example. There are other examples that I use, but I
mhm,
mean, for example, I'll take the transcript of an interview that a client did and
mhm,
compare it to the final story that resulted, and say, okay,
mhm,
what did the reporter get right and wrong from the transcript, or how much did the reporter misquote the client?
mhm.
you know, and
It's always interesting to see what they key in on too. It's like, you prepare, you anticipate the questions, and
Yeah, yeah,
you do a lot of work, and then it's like maybe like, just a couple sound bites make it into the finished
that's right.
piece or something. So
Well, that's another thing we try to teach our clients. So how do you become more quotable, you know?
yeah,
And what
yeah,
sound bites and what's going to get someone interested, and there are certain executives that maybe shouldn't do interviews, and others that are so fabulous you don't have to even train them.
yeah. Yeah, Sean is talking about, he's saying internal PR teams using AI to create
Right.
content, which is, yeah, it's not really going to be.
It's not good. In fact, my buddy over at the Wall Street Journal, who used to be at PR Week, whose name just flew out of my head, just did a post on one of the platforms, Twitter, et cetera. He received an AI generated pitch,
Hmm.
and it was just, I think he posted on LinkedIn. Uh, he received an AI generated pitch, and I commented on it. That was really really bad. But AI is good as for the examples that I gave. I do have one client that says, "Oh, Peter," and they're right about internal PR teams versus agencies. They'll say, "Well, can you do me a favor? Can you get your robot to analyze this interview or analyze this script?" Sure, I'll get one of my robots to do it.
Well, I think it's interesting that Sean's talking about internal PR teams, because I find that agencies are often, misusing AI and technology, and also
Yeah.
media databases, and they're just, I mean, they're basing results on how many pitches they send out or something like that. And I'm like, no, that is not,
Yeah.
that's not how we do this. That's not what we should be
Well,
measuring.
back to your original question. The very first question was like, why should do clients really, recognize the value of alternative media, et cetera? And
Mhm.
and for years it used to be, if in advertising, for example, you take an ad out, or you buy an ad or buy a 30-second spot on the Super Bowl, you have a lot of ways to measure the effectiveness of that ad. Did the ad produce product sales or whatever, and they have tangible results, tangible, measurement. Whereas in PR, they're still measuring based on impressions, not
Mhm.
so much on, let me just click this off. Um, Not so much on what the effect of the story was. And so that's where you need to be thinking. I mean, granted, the clients will pay you by impressions, by audience, by
Mhm.
amplification.
Mhm.
And so if we're getting paid that way, that's fine. We'll measure that way. But the truth of the matter is, did the stock price go up? Did you see more sales? Was there a
Mhm.
was a regulatory agency now interested in this issue? And so that's sort of where you want to get with your media relations. You want to create action. You want to create tangible results versus number of impressions. Though clients are still paying by number of impressions. They
Well, here's the thing though. I feel like education is so important, because I think I do see, like, I see PR pros who really want to get away from measuring using AVEs, for example. They want to measure, more meaningful numbers. But it is the C-suite that's kind of, they're not up to speed maybe on what is actually, how to do this in a better way, do this in a more effective way. And so I think that there's pressure from them, while even if PR pros want to try to really bring more meaningful value and show more meaningful measurement, I think sometimes there's pushback, and there's a lack of education and understanding, and sometimes, it's really hard to fight that battle.
Well, AI can be very useful. So you could take the coverage of an issue of a story across multiple brands, and then ask what the quality, and ask an AI like Claude or one of those, Perplexity or OpenAI, ChatGPT. Ask them what the the quality, do a qualitative analysis of the coverage. So you're right. I talked about what hasn't changed in our industry. The one thing that hasn't changed is the way we measure results. I mean, maybe Katie Delahaye may disagree, but we still measure by eyeballs, and not
Mhm.
so much on other impacts.
Mhm.
We'll measure by, well, was the story positive, negative, neutral? How many people saw it? How many social media posts were there? Or how many times was it reposted or liked or whatever? So there are other ways to measure, but again, they're still missing the point: is what did it do for the business? What did it do to
Mm.
create sales, to generate qualified leads, to open doors for prospective clients for a B2B company, to increase the stock price, et cetera. So that's where you want to go. And that's where the narrowcasting, to John Lee's point, is important,
Mhm.
is really segmenting what you want to do, because you don't need the Today Show to move the stock price. You might need Barron's, so uh,
Right.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, for publicly traded companies, it's an entirely different ballgame, than it is for, companies that are, privately held. So, I mean, I have a lot of, empathy for folks working with a lot of those types of clients. So,
yeah. I mean,
yeah.
listen, I will say this about the media: we have some serious issues, and we had serious issues in the last 5 years. I mean, Margaret Sullivan. In fact, I'm going to see Margaret Sullivan and Ben Smith talk at the New York Historical Society tonight on how they're covering how the media is doing covering the new Trump administration. I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's webcast as well. So if you go to the New
Oh.
York Historical Society, it's going to be an interesting thing. But the fact is that Margaret Sullivan has a book that talked about these media deserts. So no newspapers in a lot of
Mhm.
markets across the
Mhm.
country. And then David Enrich, who's a very well-regarded investigative reporter at the New York Times, has a brand new book out talking about the campaign to eliminate, you know, journalism, and I mean, you just saw that the Voice of America is being shut down. The Voice of America,
Mhm.
NPR is going to get its public broadcasting funding pulled,
Mhm.
and then you have a whole campaign that's looking to do away with Times versus Sullivan, which was the landmark ruling that gave newspapers their First Amendment right to call out wrongdoing by politicians and whatever, and those protections are being threatened. So the David Enrich book might be something. So I guess I'm finding that I meet a lot of PR people in my decades in this industry, and a lot of them, they just don't do they have to follow. You have to have your finger on the pulse. You have to read
Mhm.
books. You have to follow, thought leaders in the space to really understand it. And by the way, if you represent clients in a certain industry, you need to know what keeps that client up at night. Okay, you need to
Mhm.
really delve down into the trades, into the beat reporters for that industry, and know what the zeitgeist is. And so, yeah. I find I don't know,
Yeah.
a lot of folks, especially young folks in our industry, just don't do it.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. If you're getting all of your news from TikTok and you're not actually, looking into actual news sources and following the headlines, you might be at a deficit trying to
Right.
work in PR. So,
That's why the demise of Twitter is so disconcerting, because it did have a lot of news, and no longer. I mean, you have a lot of journalists on there still, but it was a it was a water cooler for the news industry, for the media industry, and it no longer is.
well, I am going to say on that note, we are hitting our hour, and I want to thank you so much, Peter, for being here. Wow, what an interesting discussion, and we had some great questions and participation. So I really appreciate everybody, um, you know, engaging and asking questions because that helps us,
Keep the ball rolling.
provide
So,
the
yeah.
information that they need and want. So it's given me a lot to think about. I know that. So I thank you for being here.
Well, my pleasure, Michelle. Thanks for having me, and hopefully this will gain some amplification across social, and people will see it, and we'll take it from there. So anyway.
Be sure to follow Peter across social medias. LinkedIn, I put his LinkedIn up. I put his website up. His Medium posts are great. So be sure to follow those. And please come back for another episode of PR Explored. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and I will be posting more about that, of course, on social media as well. So thanks, everybody.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone. Bye, Michelle.
Bye.